Can we see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. So, hi, I'm Rebecca. All of my details are on that slide there for you, except usefully my Twitter handle, which is @BexN91. I'm going to spend the next 25 minutes-ish talking to you about Rosenshine's principles of instruction and how they could help us as MFL teachers. The presentation I'm delivering today intends to give you ideas and suggestions of the kinds of things we could be doing as teachers to support our students. Ideas which follow Rosenshine's findings and should therefore help your students to make progress. Some of you might be in schools where this kind of thing is regularly discussed, and so you're very familiar with it. Others of you may be hearing this for the first time. I hope there's something here for everyone. Also, please don't expect to be seeing loads of high-flying new ideas because they just aren't coming. Much of this presentation aims to show you how you are already doing many of the things Rosenshine recommends and will just make you more aware of them, allowing you to do them more, to build them into your curriculum planning, or enable you to demonstrate if you need to, for example, to your senior leadership, your understanding of how to support learning for long-term retention. The content of my presentation today is a cut down version of some of the work I did for the Accelerate programme for the Chartered College of Teaching, and I believe that this work will be published to Chartered College members on their early career hub in the not too distant future. So, who is Barack Rosenshine? He started off as a high school history teacher and then moved on to complete a PhD in education at Stanford University. And it was later in his career, whilst working at the University of Illinois, that he worked on the principles that we're going to discuss today. He taught educational psychology and published papers on topics such as teacher performance, direct instruction, strategies based on cognitive science. So prior to the development of the 10 principles that we're discussing today, he laid out 6 instructional functions, and these later developed into the principles of instruction. The problem with a list as clear as Rosenshine's is that there will always be those that seek to misinterpret and misuse it. So as you can see from this quote here, Rosenshine recognised the danger of these principles, and this is something we have to be especially mindful of. They are not a checklist for planning. They are not things that need to be in every lesson. They are points for consideration and to help guide effective teaching. So remember, they are not a silver bullet and they are no replacement for the great subject-specific pedagogical training you've had. They're there to support and to guide and nothing more. So, principle 1. In order for students to commit their learning to long-term memory, Rosenshine recommends that every lesson begins with a short review of previous learning. It's really easy to get frustrated when a class has seemingly forgotten everything you taught them only last week or that they should remember from year 7. And a problem that we face as teachers is that methods that may seem to rapidly increase student performance in a lesson fail to support long-term learning of that knowledge. And for this reason, it's advisable to incorporate what Bjork coined as desirable difficulties into your teaching. So it might seem at the time as if students are not performing as well, but in fact, that which students find easy is not always what is best for their learning. So this may explain why students frequently use skills which are ineffective, like just highlighting everything, because they find that easy and that makes them feel more confident in the moment. However, when we're aiming for long-term retention of knowledge, a little struggle is actually for the best. So as teachers, there are a number of ways in which we can combat this forgetting, and a review at the start of every lesson is one of those things. Now, reviewing from previous lessons can be done in a number of ways, so you don't have to feel as if you're doing the same thing at the start of every lesson. It soon becomes part of routine and is a good way of getting students settled at the beginning of the lesson. So the most important thing about this review is that it's encouraging students to think, as according to Willingham's much used quote, memory is the residue of thought. Allowing students access to their notes during this time is somewhat against the point. What we're after is that our students really have to think about the knowledge that they need to recall, not immediately giving up and looking at a vocabulary sheet. So they can initially be quite reluctant to do this, but it's important that they're shown that they're not going to learn if they're constantly relying on their resources. So I tell my students that if your brain knows it can always just flip back a few pages and read the information, there's no reason for it to bother to ever try and remember. And that'll be a big issue in an exam situation when they can't just check their notes. So the first consideration when planning is to decide what knowledge you need the students to reactivate in order to get the most from the lesson you're teaching. You might also choose to use that review as a way of bringing back knowledge that you don't necessarily plan to use in that lesson, but that students need to retain over time. Another important point to consider is that this review or testing should be low stakes. So if we're collecting scores and tracking and issuing sanctions, then these stakes aren't low. The pressures on our students and the temptation to look at their notes is definitely higher. And also these kinds of tests just encourage students to cram all their learning just before the test, and it's not going to help in the long term. So the aim here is not to assess students, but to help their long-term memory. So avoid that temptation of trying to kill two birds with one stone. It's not going to have the desired effect. So on the slide here are some retrieval practice activities. They are all over Twitter and Instagram and Facebook groups these days, so you probably know quite a few already. These ones on the screen are all provided in a PowerPoint on my website, and the original creators are all credited there too. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot out there right now on retrieval practice. Any of these books would be good to take a look at. Another great one is Teachers versus Tech. Daisy, the author of the book, is very keen on Quizlet, which is something MFL teachers tend to be quite keen on too. But it is really worth considering though how we're using tools like Quizlet and what thinking our students are having to do. So with that in mind, I've also added to this slide some links from my own blog where I've considered some of these issues. So Rosenshine's second principle states that new material should be presented in small steps with plenty of student practice between each. This is because too much new information can overload the working memory and significantly reduce the amount of learning that's able to take place. So to deal with the limitations of the working memory, we can work through new processes one step at a time, practicing each one until it's been mastered. So take, for example, constructing an opinion with a comparative in Spanish or French. There are a number of parts that a student must have an understanding of in order to form the whole. So firstly, students need to have a clear understanding of nouns and articles. They need to understand gender and number and know how this affects the language. In Spanish, they need to understand the difference between gusta and gustan. And in French, they need to understand why parce que plus elle is becoming parce qu'elle. They need to understand the verb ser or the verb être and the adjective agreement. Presenting all this information to students at once, just like I've just read, would be far too overwhelming. And that's why we teach opinions and adjective agreement before we tackle comparatives. Then we present the information in smaller chunks, ensuring that students understand every step of the way. We can do this in various ways, perhaps starting with some activities on mini whiteboards, translating some opinions to refresh that knowledge before adding anything new. We could then maybe work on some multiple choice questions to check student understanding of adjective agreement. Something like Plickers is really useful for this, and in a minute I will talk about that for anyone who's not used Plickers before. So once these initial concepts are understood, we can move on to modelling how to form a comparative, giving plenty of different examples, questioning our students to check their understanding. But we do, of course, need to remember the limitations of our memory. If students appear to have mastered this at the end of the lesson, that's great, but it's going to need revisiting a number of times before it becomes part of their long-term memory. So another area where it's useful to introduce new information in steps is tackling certain types of exam question. So for example, at GCSE, students are expected to describe a photograph in the speaking exam. So to begin with, students are often unsure of what's expected, and they might just list a whole load of nouns that are associated with the picture. So many teachers choose to use some sort of structure, for example, this PALM WOJ, people, action, location, mood, weather, opinion, justification, to help students form their answers. When first introducing this, the cognitive load on the student would just be far too great if they were told to do all the elements at once. So to ease that load, you work on the people element first, ensuring they understand the structures they need, applying them to different photos before moving on to action, location, etc. Once students are confident with each of these elements, they can be built up to form the whole description. So I mentioned Plickers just now, so I've added this in. So if you've not used Plickers before, I think it is really good. Each student has a printed QR code. Now, usually I'd have one laminated set to reuse, but in the current circumstances, maybe you might get each student to stick one into their book to keep so that there isn't any passing of those around. You set up some multiple choice questions and students have to hold their card up a particular way around to indicate their answer. And you can then scan the room with mobile phone or tablet that's got the app installed, and it automatically generates a report to show you how students have answered. You can even show the graph on the screen in real time, making it easy to discuss and address misconceptions. And the great thing about this is that students can't see the answers that others are giving, so they have to think for themselves. And it also takes away some of the anxiety of being wrong, as no one else will know if you're wrong or right. So our third principle: despite the belief that some teachers must limit the amount of time they spend talking in the classroom, Rosenshine found that the most successful teachers spent more than half the lesson time lecturing, demonstrating, and asking questions. In fact, from a language learning perspective, this makes perfect sense. Where are the students going to hear the language being modelled if it's not by you? But questioning in MFL is very different to other subjects, as other than when we're explicitly teaching grammar, we're not often asking questions about concepts, we're asking them to use and practice the language. So like I said, kind of questioning falls into two categories: checking for understanding of structures and rules, and checking students' ability to manipulate and use the language. So the first category is where MFL is most similar to other subject areas. This is where we should be asking as many questions as we can to different students and asking for greater levels of depth and ensuring that all misconceptions are addressed. It's also important to establish how students reach their answers to make sure they fully understand the process. So the example on the screen might be one way of doing this. When students have their own devices, tools like GymKit, quizzes, Kahoot are great for engaging students and answering a large amount of questions without necessarily realising it. This has the double benefit of them practicing for an extended period of time, but also allowing you to download the scores to check where the misconceptions occurred. These questions, as with all multiple choice questions, must be very carefully written in order to ensure that there's a good level of plausibility for each option, so that students need to think carefully about the answer. After all, as mentioned in Principle 1, memory is the residue of thought. Students will remember what they have had to think about. So because of this, the use of apps must be well controlled. Students can often get away with the competition element and stop concentrating on the questions. If this is the case, you may as well not be bothering with the activity if they're not thinking about the right thing, and it's just not going to have the learning effect you were after. So without the use of technology, there are still a number of ways to ensure that you ask a large number of questions to as many students as possible. And one book that you could look for this in is Teach Like a Champion by Doug Lemov. There's a variety of ways suggested of doing this. So of course, another purpose of questioning in MFL is actually to practice the language. So questions designed for practicing language can seem artificial, but this isn't necessarily an issue. And as addressed in Steve Smith's 2018 book, Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher, there's a hierarchy of question types that can elicit more complex responses. And planning this kind of sequence in advance is the best way to get the most out of it. Of course, we know that time constraints might make it difficult to hear language produced by all students in a class, and maybe not just time constraints, but distancing restraints at the moment, especially across a Key Stage 3 class or a large Key Stage 4. You could try an electronic method like Socratic or quizzes, which allow students to type in responses, or the good old-fashioned mini whiteboard, depending on your preference. So Rosenshine's fourth principle advises the use of models, worked examples, and teacher thinking out loud to help students solve problems faster for themselves. In MFL, there are a number of different problems that our students might need to solve, from conjugating a verb to constructing an opinion, translating a text, to answering a reading comprehension question. The key to this is that we want to reduce the cognitive load our students are facing, reducing how much they're having to think and what they're having to think about, to make it easier for them to take on the information that we need them to. So let's take translation as an example. In this case, a visualizer is particularly helpful for modelling, and I don't know about anybody else, but I am really missing mine and I'm going from class to class at the moment. So rather than just telling our students that we want them to annotate a text, we can use a visualizer to show them step by step what it is that they need to do and explain our thought processes. So without this explanation, our students are likely just to jump straight into the translation in front of them without careful consideration of the structure of the text, the grammar, the vocabulary knowledge that they're going to need. Providing models is also really useful for writing tasks. So for example, at GCSE maybe, we can provide a task with bullet points and explain what must be covered in the response. And alongside the task, we could provide a model answer. Rather than provide the completed version, we could complete this with the class, discussing the bullet points, demonstrating the planning process, and how we ensure that we cover all parts of the mark scheme or all important processes for our students to understand. Models and worked examples are not only useful for reducing written and spoken language, but also for answering comprehension questions based on text or speech. Teachers can model processes for finding answers in a text, help students tackle these questions themselves in exam conditions. And again, a visualiser is particularly useful in this situation. If you've not read Making Every Lesson Count, I can highly recommend it. There's a whole chapter based on modelling. And the excellent MFL specific version of this book covers broadly similar ideas, but focused in on MFL, and I wholeheartedly recommend getting hold of both of those. So Rosenshine's fifth principle, guiding students' practice of new material, sits between modelling and independent practice. In guided practice, students will need the processes that have been modelled previously and won't be completely ready to practice without being led by the teacher. At this stage, students will need close supervision and lots of feedback. So one of the simplest ways to guide student practice is to use mini whiteboards. This gives you the opportunity to make sure that all students are practicing exactly what they need to, following step by step what you've shown them and reaching the correct answer. So for example, modelling a new grammar point and then asking students to manipulate the language for themselves. This way students are still having time to think for themselves and come up with their responses, but they're not being left to do it totally alone, and you can quickly check the whole class. A well-constructed worksheet could also provide good guided practice, stopping in between exercises to go over the answers as a class, explaining them, correcting misconceptions, and allowing students to self-assess their work. The important thing is that students are given the opportunity to focus on the area that needs practice, without interference from other elements and with teacher feedback and supervision. There are, of course, tech alternatives to what we've discussed, each with their own advantages and disadvantages. So many of the apps we've already mentioned would allow you to do this. Things like quizzes, Kahoot, also allow for slides of information to be built into that quiz. So that's something that you might want to consider. Rosenshine's sixth principle is to check for understanding. And in fact, checking student understanding and acting upon this is something we're always expected to do, and in one way or another tend to do instinctively. However, too often, checking student understanding has been reduced to a show of thumbs up, thumbs down, traffic lights, smiley and sad faces, to reflect how students feel about their current understanding. And whilst this may give us an idea of our students' current level of confidence, it doesn't let us know what they do and don't understand, or usefully inform our next steps. So we need to decide if we're checking for knowledge of the language or ability to use it in context, and then we need to consider how we're going to go about checking. This, of course, will depend on our purpose. If we're checking understanding to inform our next steps in a given lesson, then the tool we use to assess students may be quite different to what we might use to check their understanding at the end of the unit. Most importantly, part of checking student understanding is what you do with that information. Giving students timely feedback is essential, but can contribute to workload pressures. Giving feedback doesn't have to be an onerous task, so think about your next steps. A poor score on a multiple choice question could just require the correction of a simple misconception before answering another similar set of questions. Instead of marking and giving detailed feedback on a whole piece, you could focus on the grammar concept that's just been taught or use of specific structures or phrases. Once we've checked our students' understanding, we need to remember that this really is only a snapshot of the current situation. Will students still have the same understanding in a few weeks or a few days? What about when they're under exam conditions? The other principles we've discussed or are yet to come into play here. Weekly and monthly review of this knowledge is necessary for making these long-term memories. Now, as I said, I did some writing for the Charter College, and when I did it, I had a good look at this report about assessment in MFL, and I found it really interesting reading. So that slide's there for you in case you're interested in that. So next, the seventh principle encourages teachers to make sure that all students achieve a high success rate during practice. As many of these principles are, this would seem like common sense. And that said, there are a number of complications related to this principle. To my mind, the first issue here is to do with how we are defining success. In many other subjects, I suppose this comes down to the number of correct answers a student can give, and this can't be applied in quite the same way to language learning. We all know, without needing research to tell us, that when we do well at something, we tend to enjoy it more and probably want to do it more. And there's, of course, much more to motivation than that. But on a basic level, it's something we need to remember. The key here is how do we help our students feel successful and confident, and therefore, we hope, enjoy their language learning more. Of course, the solution isn't just to make things easier. Oh, too far. Helping our students to feel successful in their language learning is a difficult balance. Pitch a lesson too low and students can feel the work is too easy, boring, pointless. Pitch it too high, on the other hand, and they can just feel that they aren't any good at languages, will never understand it and should just stop trying. So factor this into the fact that many of us are teaching classes with a huge range of abilities, and we find ourselves with a problem. Clear presentation, scaffolding, structured and repeated practice, logical progression, and effective feedback will all contribute to this feeling of success. We need to use this to help our students feel more confident in the language, and this way they're likely to want to contribute in class more because there's less fear of being wrong. In his book, Teach Like a Champion, that I've already mentioned, Doug Lemov has an entire chapter dedicated to planning for success. And in the book, he says the most effective teachers help as many students as possible meet or exceed a high standard of excellence. To do this, they view the lesson from the student's perspective and then systematically add supports or remove obstacles to success without diluting rigour. To do this effectively, we'll need to consider the importance of scaffolding, which is the focus of Principle 8. Rosenshine's 8th principle encourages teachers to provide their students with scaffolds in order to learn how to complete difficult tasks. And this is a principle that can be applied to any of the 4 core language skills and at all key stages. In teaching students how to tackle difficult tasks, we may encourage them to use certain strategies as supports in order to help bridge the gap between their current ability and the intended learning outcome. So there are some examples here for you that, again, I asked the owners of these permission at the time when I was doing the writing for the Chartered College. So structure strips, when setting a written task using bullet points, you might provide students with a strip so that they can stick it into their books, and that takes them through the task step by step. You might want to include different types of prompts. Like the middle one, step-by-step breakdown and checklists using a scaffold sheet to help them work through all the steps of a task, set out so that they can actually complete the task on the sheet. And acronyms. There's many acronyms being used by language teachers for different purposes, but this is just one example that takes them through a set of steps that helps them prepare before answering a question. Of course, another type of scaffolding would be to use writing frames or sentence builders. These are increasingly common at the moment, and whilst I'm trying to use them myself, I'm far from expert, and there are many teachers freely sharing their ideas on social media, so they're well worth taking a look at. Coming to Rosenshine's 9th principle, it's the aim that the preceding 8 have all been leading up to. If our students have practiced at different times with varying levels of support, then it's logical that we would later want them to be able to do these things independently. We've already discussed different ways of practicing, depending on what it is we're intending our students to learn, and now's the opportunity to discuss how this very structured and well-supported practice can become independent. So as language teachers, there are a number of things we want our students to be good at and be able to do automatically. And how we view these things will often depend on what we're preparing our students for. So for example, teachers might have very different aims if you're not teaching GCSE exams, for example. Before this stage, students would have practiced very specific parts of the task many times. They'll have seen worked examples, they'll have seen what you expect the final outcome to be, and they'll know the steps involved in getting there. So the aim in this final practice stage is to show that students can now complete these tasks on their own without close supervision. It's important that they are now expected to complete the whole task themselves without the scaffolds that you would previously have put in place. So as long as there's been sufficient practice beforehand, this won't be an issue. And if it's too hard, then students haven't practiced sufficiently yet, not ready for this independent practice. So Rosenshine's 10th principle and final principle relates to the frequency at which we're expecting students to review their knowledge. Of course, we already know that maths practice will create short-term confidence, but it won't lead to long-term learning. So this will need to be reviewed over time. Spacing practice is most effective for studying a test after a delay, making it an ideal way to apply our teaching when preparing students for an exam that's a long way off. It's particularly important that we continue to bring previous learning to mind, not only so that students are encouraged to remember it, but also so that they can apply this knowledge to a new context. Frequent review allows us to encourage students to link structures learned in one topic to their knowledge of others. So we can encourage this weekly and monthly review in different ways, either through starter activities and lessons or through homework. We could also consider how we're structuring our assessments and if we're requiring students to retrieve knowledge from modules other than the one they've just been studying. Homework policies will of course vary from school to school, but where possible you could consider structuring the homework you set so that it incorporates plenty of reviewing of learning. Structuring this well could take some time, looking at what students have studied and when it's due to come up again, but in the long term it should pay off as students will be more prepared with previous learned language and structures. Importantly though, we must acknowledge that a lot of regular reviewing just happens as a natural part of language learning. We don't teach the present tense and just once and then never return to it. Neither do we do a one-off lesson on adjective agreement and never need it again. These are fundamental parts of language that we constantly come back to and expect students to practice time and time again for different topics. However, we do need to be aware of and plan opportunities for purposeful review when it comes to topic-specific vocabulary that students might forget, or for lesser used structures that don't naturally come up all the time. It's important to consider what it is that you need students to remember in the long term and make sure that they're frequently being asked to think about exactly that across different contexts, different types of tasks, and in production and comprehensive language to help them develop that well-connected and automatic knowledge that we are aiming for. So I hope this presentation has given you an insight into Rosenshine's principles and how they can be applied to MFL. I really hope that from this presentation you can see that these principles aren't another fad or gimmick, but another helpful way of summarising some of the points of effective teaching. So there's some suggestions of some books here, and on the final slide, which I'll show you but looks overwhelming, here are all the sources I referred to when first writing about the application of principles for the Chartered College of Teaching Accelerate course. So hopefully that will be available on the Early Career Hub at some point in the not too distant future. If you're a member, you'll be able to access it once it's there, and I'll try and share the link on Twitter, etc. But yes, for any of you interested, there are my references from that piece of work. And that's it, Flavia.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was really great summary and explanation, and really well put into the context of modern foreign languages. That's great. There are a few questions for you. So, how many questions should be used for the low-stake quizzes in the beginning of the lesson? What kind of format?
It's kind of a how long is a piece of string kind of question. It depends how much time you want to spend on it, but I tend to like to give them 5 minutes or 10 minutes at the start of the lesson, especially in times like this where I'm running from room to room setting up. So it depends how long you want them to spend on it, but if you have a look at some of those examples on there, maybe they've got 5 different tasks to do, or if it's, I don't know, 10 words to remember. Yeah, it's a how long is a piece of string kind of question, but not loads. You're not aiming to spend loads of time on it. It's let's quickly get this back and move on to the rest of the lesson.
Okay, awesome. There was a question about whether Steve Smith's book addresses primary as well as secondary, I think you mentioned there. But also, just to pull together, there was another question about whether you think all of those examples and principles apply equally to, Key Stage 3, A-level kids of different age groups.
I'd say so. Obviously, they take adaptation each time, but the whole point is that these are the things we can do to help support learning. So obviously, the things you're going to do in Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 5 are going to be very different, and the things you want them to recall and revise and those kinds of things. But yes, in general, those principles should apply across the range.
Okay, great. Do you have any specific example or tip for each key stage? Because I think we have teachers from all over the range.
Yeah, I myself teach 3 to 5, so I'm sorry, Key Stage 2 teachers, that's not something I've got at all. Key Stage 3, all of those retrieval starters that I had there, I use. Key Stage 4, for me, I'm trying to do a lot of let's bring back something totally different at the start of the lesson, because let's say we're studying the work topic now, but they haven't done the holidays topic for a long time, so I'll be bringing that back as much as possible. And I think it's very easy to forget to do with Key Stage 5. We can get very bogged down in these are the topics we need. And I think that's something I personally need to consider more, how I'm going to work on that with Key Stage 5.
Yep, super. So just a new question here from Emma. Do you do traditional vocabulary tests, or does the retrieval practice start to replace them?
So it's hard. I think if there are a test where students have been given a specific list of words to learn and then told you will be tested on these at the beginning of next lesson, I think there's a very strong chance that those students are going to cram those words and those words only for that lesson. And I therefore wouldn't say that that's a good retrieval practice. It might be something you still want to do, might be something you're still doing as part of your teaching. I'm not saying not to do those things, but I think long term, they're unlikely to then remember that 10 words that you asked them to learn for Wednesday. Ask them next Wednesday, they may well have forgotten those first 10 words again.
Yep. And I think last question now. If your students have a low level of English literacy, which is preventing them from accessing modern foreign languages, do you have any advice? That's what they ask.
I wouldn't even want to step into that area. I wouldn't want to step on the toes of people who know more about that kind of thing. I'll stick to Rosenshines for now, I think.
Okay.
The wrong thing.
Yeah, no problem at all. Well, we're out of time anyway. So thank you very much, Rebecca. That was really, really great. Can you repeat to everybody how to get in touch with you if they have more questions? Or...
Yeah, so everything on the slide has got my website on it there. On Twitter, I'm at BexN91. And there seem to be a lot more MFL teachers coming over to Instagram. So if you look on the hashtag MFL Insta, which was set up by Claire Wilson, and I'm on there under my podcast title, so at Page Practice Podcast, and that's practice with a C.
Okay, great. Super. Thank you very much. Just want to say as well to everybody, if you're new to this environment, that, you know, at Seneca, the whole thing about Seneca Learning is that it's a whole set of small, low-stake quizzes. So it fits perfectly well with some of the Rosenshine principles. And if you're looking for quizzes and low-stake quizzes to share with your students, then Seneca is perfect and it's free. So quick tip. Okay, so now we have